Welcome, everyone. We're going to take just another minute or two to let folks get into the Zoom room and get us hooked up to YouTube. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to begin by offering a bienvenida, a welcome to all of you. My name is Victoria DeFrancesco Soto. I'm the Assistant Dean for Civic Engagement here at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And the commemoration of Hispanic Heritage Month, which kicks off today, is very important to me for a number of reasons. I mean, from the personal point, as a Latina, but also from the professional. I am a researcher in race and ethnic politics, focusing on Latinos, but there's also a contextual piece that is very important to us here at the LBJ School and at the University of Texas. LBJ, President Lyndon B. Johnson, on September 17th, 1968, 53 years ago, signed Proclamation 3869, proclaiming Hispanic Heritage Week, later becoming Hispanic Heritage Month. President Johnson was the first president of the United States who really had an intimate engagement with Latinos. For those of you history buffs and know a little bit about President Johnson's biography, some of the most formative years he spent were as a school teacher in Cotulla, Texas. So President Johnson recognized the power of the Latino community, their contributions, and commemorated that. So this is an especially important moment for us here at the LBJ School and at the University of Texas, because as many of you may know, we are on the cusp of becoming a Hispanic serving institution. So I could not be more pleased to have with me today Carlos Odio, one of the foremost experts on Latino demographics, Latino policy trends, political trends, to help us unpack the complexity and the nuance of Latinidad here in the United States. A little bit about Carlos, but I'm not going to give you too much because we're going to get into a conversation. I'd rather him tell you a little bit more about himself. But Carlos is a native of Miami, Florida. Carlos has a long trajectory in terms of civic engagement and politics, from on the ground to communications to having served in the Obama White House. Carlos is the co-founder of EquisLabs. EquisLabs, which we'll be talking a little bit about later, is this amazing tool that provides data, but also the contextual information and knowledge to understand what the data is telling us with respect to Latinos. So there's a whole lot to unpack. I'm going to be quiet because I want to hear from Carlos. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Carlos. Mil gracias for joining us, for helping us kick off Hispanic Heritage Month.
And thank you so much, Dr. Soto, for having me on, and LBJ School for welcoming us and talking about Equis. Vicki and I talk about these things a great deal, as we've talked about them for a long time. Part of what we do at Equis is rely and pull in trying to fill in gaps in our understanding of Latino voters. We pull in knowledge, data from wherever we can get it. So much of what we do is try to bridge academia with applied politics, with what's being done in campaigns in the field, and inform in both directions. So with that, I want to share a few slides. It is very hard always to narrow because we have a lot of it, but I want to just speak broadly for a second to and give some examples on the complexities of Latino voters, because that's so much what we try to do here, how the data challenges assumptions and conventional wisdoms, and how data can be used to capture rather than flatten the identities of individual voters. And so I want to use the example because it was very popular a few weeks ago when the census numbers came out. While many of you might be in Texas, we're going to talk about Puerto Rico. We're going to start there because this was an example where the new census data came out, and you saw a 60-point shift in the share of Puerto Ricans that identified as white on the racial category. It went from 76% to 17%. Obviously, that is eye-catching. It happened in many Hispanic dense areas. In Miami, the multiracial category jumped from 2.4% to around 42%. So these huge changes where you see white identification going down, multiracial category going up. Now, people like me see this, and reporters are calling, and they want to write a very sexy story about how self-conception of race might have changed over a decade, how the conversations we've had around race have led people to explore their own identities and complicate it, maybe move people away from identifying as white. And the reality is probably a big part of that happened, but there's a less sexy story. There's an unsexy story underneath that is a story about data. There's about how the census asks people about their identities and their race. And this is the canvasser form that we used on the census last year. Everything in red is new. And so as people were asking about race, it used to be a pretty blunt instrument. Now there's an actual prompting for individual national origin groups. This is what it looked like. So imagine a canvasser using this to interview a Latino with any kind of mixed ancestry, AKA most Latinos. Hispanic ethnicity still remains a separate question on the census, but it was altered in a way that meant that specificity could be captured, especially in these examples of national origin, which we all have. On top of that, the way these are coded got changed. And so you can look at this example, how someone who identified as Cuban in a write-in response, how that got disregarded in 2010. But then in 2020, that would then have that person be coded as multiracial. And so it isn't hard to imagine in this example how more specificity on the race form might in turn grow this multiracial category. So again, this doesn't mean that the census numbers on mixed race are inaccurate or that they're somehow quirky. The way we talk about identity does shift. There was actually a lot of advocacy to get the census to change how they ask these questions. It's actually, to me, more interesting because what you're seeing is that the census got better at capturing how Latinos talk about themselves and think about their own ancestry, which is rarely one little label. So we kind of met in the middle. This is where methodology and the realities of identity kind of met in the middle. And the data was better able to capture these changes. That is so important, obviously, and in terms of, again, not using data to flatten, but using data to better capture complexity. So with that, we come to some of the more fun stuff with the elections, because when we started EquisLabs, one of the big things we did was say, we want people say that Latinos aren't a monolith. They have a very hard time operationalizing that. How can we help people understand and wrap their heads around the idea that Latinos aren't a monolith? But there's a danger in going in the opposite direction and saying that being Latino isn't a thing either. And actually, the 2020 results show that while we aren't a monolith, we might still be a group. The shifts that we saw happen toward Trump among Latinos cut across geography and place of origin. The size of the shifts might be different, but there were unique dynamics that were taking place among Hispanic communities. And it wasn't just among one kind of Latino. It was Dominicans in Passaic County, New Jersey, and Lawrence, Massachusetts. It was Mexican immigrants in Milwaukee or Las Vegas, Nevada. It was multi-generational in Texas. It was all kinds, all places. Some places it was worse. There was a baseline shift toward Trump. There was accelerants that made the shift much more dramatic in a place like South Texas or in South Florida. But largely speaking, there was something that was happening that wasn't happening in the rest of the electorate. And that's really important to understand going forward in terms of the assumptions that we bring to bear onto the politics. Because what remains true is that Hispanics are one of the last great wild cards in politics. We're in a very polarized electorate. People have gone to their corners. They've chosen their party. So much of campaigning, whether advocacy or electoral, ends up being a trench warfare to win some inches among suburban white women in certain congressional districts. And so when you have large chunks of the electorate that are still in play, that ends up complicating things in a really good way, right? It creates more opportunity for change. And the evidence there, you see Latinos swung more than other more than non-Latino API, non-Latino Black, or non-Latino white. Latinos grew their share of the electorate more than the other categories, despite only 50% of eligible Latinos turning out. So you had AAPI grow tremendously there. So Latinos were turning out at 12 to 13 points lower than AAPI or Black voters, 20 something points lower than white voters. That's a very big difference. And it means you have a lot of voters that, even as we think about 2020 and what happened in 2020, sat out 2020 and are eligible and could change elections going forward. No two elections are the same, and the electorate churns. And that's why this other assumption we make. So this is charting the likelihood that a Latino voter is to vote. In campaigns, in the larger progressive ecosystem, actually it happens on the conservative side too as well, people try to model the likelihood that someone is going to undergo a behavior, whether it's voting for Democrat or Republican. This was a turnout score, and this was from our polling. And what we were showing in our polling at Equis in late 2019, throughout 2019, is that the difference in how low propensity, less likely voters, and very likely voters saw Donald Trump was not significantly different. And so if you turned out low propensity voters, you're going to get more of the same as if you did likely voters, meaning a high Democratic margin. What ends up happening as the cycle goes on is that the low propensity voters start shifting toward Trump. And so these concepts that you hear very often in the media, a debate between, is this about turnout or is this about persuasion? Are you trying to get people to vote or are you trying to change their minds? Are not separate conversations. They're interlinked conversations. Very often, and I can show, there's a slide that shows that people are, the decision to vote and the decision to vote, who to vote for, are linked. And so I think it can surprise people when you look at Texas, and this is from postmortem polling that we did in Texas in the last couple of months. People are surprised the extent to which, you imagine 10 people voted in 2016, 10 people voted in 2020, and a couple of them changed their minds. When actually, it's really about the ones who decided to sit out or the ones who opted to vote this time who hadn't voted in 16. And if you look at the Trump Latino coalition in Texas, you might be surprised to learn the extent to which so many of them were voters without any vote history or with very little vote history. A majority of the Trump Latino voters in Texas had not voted regularly before 2020, whereas a majority of the Biden coalition Latinos were repeat voters. So again, the way we think about mobilization, the assumptions that we make about turnout targets being purely Democratic, as opposed to being purely swing voters, which I think there's more evidence of, is pretty strong. And here's another assumption. You look at Trump's voters and you compare his new voters, those ones who hadn't voted before, which are the ones in the light red, to those who were super voters, voted in all of the last 3 elections. You might not be surprised to learn the newer voters are young. No big surprise there, but I'll come back to this in one second. No surprise that Biden's new voters were also young. But you might be surprised to learn to the extent to which Trump's new voters were even younger than the Biden new voters. And in fact, you see the 30 to 39, which are the elder millennials, people in my category, I'm about to age out of that, are a very large 1 in 4 of these new Trump voters were between the age of 30 and 39. They were elder millennial, as opposed to only 15% of the Biden coalition being from that piece. So we think about young voters, how might we challenge some of these assumptions, especially as they get a little bit older? I mentioned the decision to vote and the decision who to vote for as being linked. This charts motivation to vote throughout last cycle. Top to bottom is how motivated they were to vote. Left to right is how approving they were of Donald Trump. And what you see is this is just Hispanics. You see how conservative women and conservative men didn't just move toward Trump, they actually got more excited to vote at the same time. It wasn't a passive decision. And how those two things got linked. We can talk, Vicky, separately about why people did this, because I think that's very important. But I just wanted to show the dynamic. And then lastly, in terms of what, I'll just touch on the why, because I think we'll get more into it in the discussion. I just want to talk about some of the assumptions you might hear. And I think one very common conventional wisdom is that defund the police. It was defund the police, defund the police, defund the police. And we're on, as we say at Equis, Team Truth. We want to find out where things really did move or did not move. And so we've been on a hunt to find evidence that it was defund the police or policing. And we haven't seen a lot of it. A lot of what we see for the baseline shift is the economy. And we can talk about why that might be. When you look at comparing the new Trump voters, people who got excited and voted in 20 despite not voting before, and you compare them to the Biden new excited voter, what you see is actually that on net, sorry, I would have shown you here, you see crime and safety, which is our coded racial language. Crime and safety was not, at least in their self-report, not a big motivation, was not the deciding factor for these newer voters, in a way that a larger share of the repeat voters said that it was. For these newer voters, the economy looms incredibly large. For the new Biden voter, you didn't have one thing that jumped out, but interestingly, you had a jump around racial inequality. And so if you talk about the Black Lives Matter protests and you want to talk about their impact on the election, this is just one slide. I think more data is needed, but I think this one slide suggests that the protest might have actually been a net positive for Joe Biden in Texas among Latinos. When you compare racial inequality and its salience versus the salience of something like crime and safety. That said, again, narratives aren't simple. I think we could talk more about what the reasons why RGV, the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas, might have shifted toward Trump and how immigration there might have been different. Not all Latinos voted for the same reasons. But again, I think our whole thing and what we wanted to come into this conversation with is embracing the complexity, understanding there isn't one story. If you came here for the one narrative about why Latinos did or didn't do this or what they're going to do in the future, you come to the wrong place. This is all a fun conversation about nuance, which I'm excited to get into in more depth.
Gracias, Carlos. And you're absolutely right. This is about unpacking, and we're going to do a lot of that. And I'm dying to get into Texas and unpack that. But we have to spend just a couple of minutes, Carlos, on California. So we saw the big California recall officially take place yesterday. We know that California, over a quarter of all registered voters are Latinos in California. Latinos are a formidable political presence there. Can you give us just the Cliff Notes version of kind of what happened in California and the intersection with Latinos?
Sure. And first of all, for my interest area, which is polling, the polling on the recall was wild. So voting no, which is pro Newsom, so keeping Newsom in office. There was Latino polling on Latinos was as low as 40% on no and as high as 74%. That just, at that point, you don't need polling. That is just pulling numbers out of the air. The exit polling had it at 58%, exit polling being unreliable. Precinct data and basic math probably indicates it was probably a little higher than that. I think the question that everyone is digging into now is how does that compare to 2020? So Biden probably got around 70% of the Latino vote in 2020 in California. Did Newsom get that level of support? Obviously much lower turnout, hard to tell. I think indications of what I'd say is the idea that Latinos were going to vote Newsom out was roundly rejected. That did not happen. Latinos in majority voted to keep Newsom in office. But at the same time, I think the exact levels and whether there were shifts from 18 to 20, the kind of details that I care about and that helps influence questions like, was 2020 a one-time occurrence or was it a trend? I think we still need a little more data to better understand.
Okay, and I think this goes back to that narrative that came through in 2020, where we saw Donald Trump really making some headway with regards to Latinos, something many folks did not expect. We saw that in some of your data, Carlos. The front runner of the 46 candidates, Larry Elder, was a Trump candidate. He touted his support for Trump. So I think that's where a lot of the political analysis, the back and forth, was that question mark about Latinos. But what we're seeing in terms of the data is they pretty much stuck to the numbers that we saw in 2020, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit less turnout as well. Before we jump into Texas and then zoom out a little bit to the national level and start crystal balling our 2022 and 2024, I want to remind folks that this is, as much as we can do on a webinar, a discussion, I want this to be a chance for you to ask the expert, to engage with Carlos. So please put your questions or ideas or comments into the chat box. And, I think the burning question I have, Carlos, is those inroads that Trump made with the young folks, the 18 to 29-year-olds, is this something that you foresee being sticky? Like once you've been brought to the dance, you're gonna dance with the one that brought you as we go forward into 2022, 2024 and beyond.
Yeah, that is like one of the big questions of the moment, right? how much of this was Trump? How much was this a larger phenomenon? And not just Trump, by the way, but the moment, right? I mean, part of what happened also, the dynamic in California is COVID and the unique experience Latinos had of COVID being the hardest hit in certain sectors, which also meant that in a place like Nevada, which economically had been devastated, those who had kept their jobs were very scared of a shutdown. Like, let's not rock the boat, let's preserve this, right? That's a very unique dynamic that you wouldn't replicate going forward. Trump is a businessman. The perception of him as a businessman, as the guy from The Apprentice, was very sticky. The idea that he knew how to move money, that's a popular phrase that you hear in focus groups. You had COVID. That COVID also meant that you had a big difference in campaigning, that Joe Biden wasn't actually able to be out on the road in the same way. So where Trump had been in Miami, I think countless times, you can't even say how many times, Joe Biden went 1.5 times, essentially, because of COVID restrictions and difficulties there. So that's all unique. I think the things that are worrying about what could happen going forward is part of what Trump did was try, meaning as a Republican, he actually tried to get the Latino vote. He didn't try in 2016. There was no real Latino outreach effort from Donald Trump in 2016. In 2020, I would argue it was the most aggressive in modern times. More aggressive than George W., only because he also had YouTube and social media where he could do it. But it was very aggressive invitation to Latinos. And I think there's a lesson for Republicans that when they show up and they actually do some campaigning, there are some votes to be had on the margins. So I'd say it depends on what Republicans do going forward, and also there is some agency from both parties here.
Well, and to that point, Carlos, that when Republicans show up, they can attract Latino voters. And, you know, for those of us here in Texas who remember the George W. Bush days, we know that in his reelection as governor, he won close to 50% of the Latino vote. He was here. And I think this just further reinforces a narrative we keep saying over and over again, which is that Democrats cannot take Latinos for granted. This is key. It's not just something that will be there, but something that has to be actively cultivated. And as we're talking about voting trends here nationally, I want you to wax philosophical on that intersection with the census numbers that came out a couple of weeks ago. Texas had the highest population growth of any state that was fueled by Latinos. Are these Latinos that we're seeing the ones that were being poached off into the Republican Party? What is your vision here, given the census numbers that we saw?
Yeah, and as you said, it's a good reminder that the census numbers were are not the future electorate. It was actually the electorate of 2020. So we're kind of slow in picking up what it actually looks like. But I think some of the growth trends and patterns can be are really important. You know, Latinos were a critical part of Joe Biden winning and of Democrats winning the Senate. And right now, given how education has polarized white voters, where Democrats routinely, it's been a while now, don't win a majority, since LBJ times actually, don't win a majority of the white vote, you need high Black and Latino support in order to be victorious. I think the elections of Obama in 12 in particular, and then Clinton in 16 against Trump, may have given this false sense of security that Democrats are just going to get 70% forever. Mm-hmm. Where that matches up with the census is you have a lot of voters who are coming into the electorate who don't have a strong partisan allegiance. They might default to Democrats because there is a really strong social norm that Democrats care more about Hispanics. Democrats will look after Latinos, that our interests are more aligned with Democratic Party. Of course, a sentiment that I happen to agree with. But that there is that norm out there, and it's very strong. It keeps some Latinos from staying home. Like, I'm not going to vote against Latino interests, even though I might consider myself a little bit more conservative. But there isn't an allegiance. It's not people saying, I am a hardcore Democrat. There's a lot of people who we say are ambivalent. They're kind of soft in supporting either side. They're undecided. Again, all things being as they are now, we'll end up 2-1 on the Democratic side. But so many of those votes are actually kind of up for grabs. And I think in this moment, especially when we talk about media and how media has shifted and how people can fall into different media silos on the internet, that, you know, the way people's worldviews are being shaped is dangerous for democratic prospects, that there is kind of this conservative ecosystem that is helping people make sense of the world through a very right-wing perspective. And that is a threat to democratic prospects. I think it's also probably not good for democracy in the sense that that's where disinformation prospers. But what is good for Latinos and what is good for the country is that both parties, both candidates in any race, are competing for the Latino vote.
So you talk about that softness, and that softness is something that relates to messaging and how the different parties can connect to the Latinos. We saw Republicans do a bang-up job of it this time around. Talk to me, I want to pivot for just a minute before we get into our Q&A about EquisLab, because I know that the mission of EquisLab is how to better connect, about how to better reach perhaps those voters who are ambivalent, who don't have a strong view one way or another. And it's about the data piece indeed, but it's also about the art of messaging and connecting once you have that data foundation. So Carlos, I know I have a number of students on here, LBJ students. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your path, and then also how EquisLab has brought something very new and exciting to the world of policy and strategy landscape.
Sure, yeah, happy to. I saw a big thing that we saw was when you get the traditional Latino polling that you see out of campaigns. I mean, there's a lot of great polling you see out in the world. Matt Barreto, kind of a pioneer in this way. You've had previous generation of pollsters who we work with as well. You see numbers in a place like Arizona that say that 60% of Latinos are voting for the Democrat. And people say, well, that sounds great. It's greater than 50%. But there's a big difference between 60% and 65%. And so much of the movement that you actually see happening among Latino voters is happening on what, from the perspective of the establishment and DC, are the margins. And a lot of the polling that you see that's mainstream, where you get 100 Latinos in the sample, are not picking up on what's happening in the margins. In general, 40% of eligible Latino voters don't make it onto a voter file. They are invisible. And so a big part of what we said coming into this is we want to take those voters who are oftentimes invisible to campaigns and help make them visible. And so much of this is shifting away from, what percent statewide are focusing, and more like who is moving, who is soft right now, and what do they care about, and what is it that campaigns and the establishment are not hearing them say. To address my path, and we got to Equis. Me and a colleague, Stephanie Valencia, who's like my work sister, we're co-founders of Equis. We both started on presidential campaign in 2008 together. Actually, I started in 2007. I was in Iowa. I had drank the Obama Kool-Aid. And because I spoke Spanish, I was sent to Northwest Iowa, which were the meatpacking towns. Previous to this, I worked, by the way, I worked for a theater company. I worked for a group of internet startups in New York. I had majored in Latin American literature. I am not a pollster. I just play one on Twitter. So I end up in Iowa in these meatpacking towns talking to communities of heavily Mexican immigrant who had mobilized around the 2006 immigration marches, but then had experienced a backlash in what was Steve King territory, very xenophobic area. And they saw in the caucuses of 2007, 2008, ability to impact, because a family of four can win you a delegate in a caucus situation. And so that was my introduction to elections, which happen to be elections combined with advocacy, where you see how getting people who normally are not engaged in the process engaged can really transform a process. And that is how Barack Obama wins Iowa, is tons of new voters who normally wouldn't caucus participating in that process. But Stephanie and I did the National Latino Vote together as deputies under Temo Figueroa. We worked in the White House together in kind of similar roles. We then went off and did different things in the world, but obviously kept talking about these issues and found after the 2018 midterm that so many of the gaps we'd identified were still around. And it seemed like a time to leverage the experiences we'd had at that point. Steph had worked in tech, and as a donor advisor, I'd been working in progressive organizing and field candidate recruitment. I worked also as a donor advisor, and bring those experiences to bear to help fill in some of these gaps in understanding and engagement. So that's where Equis came in, Equis was really about leaning into leaning into the complexity and bringing the same technology and sophistication we do to understanding certain suburban voters, like dissecting the soccer mom. What does it look like to apply that same kind of treatment to the Latino voter?
I love the "what is your path" question, because I think it's so important for, many of the folks who are here who are students, interested in policy, interested in making impact, to understand that there is no one path to having impact, to making positive social change. So I appreciate you sharing that with us, Carlos. We're getting a lot of questions. I think I'm just going to start at the top, which is a question that a lot of us have, and it's one that inspires a lot of passion, which is the Latinx term, right? So getting your thoughts on that, Carlos. Do you think the Latinx term alienates Democratic voters, especially in Texas and other red-purple states, and pushes Hispanic or more traditional Latino, Latina voters toward Trump? Can Texas turn blue without an increase in the Hispanic vote? So that's the second question. Let's focus first on the identity one, and then we'll tackle, we'll go deeper on Texas.
Yes. Well, this is one of those things, I say it all the time, Twitter is not real life. And so I think the extent to which Latinx being alienating is wildly overstated is because people will see the discourse happening on Twitter. I think most people in the real world are not discussing it in a real way. What I'd say is, we're named Equis in part because Ed Morales had a book called Latinx, because he liked the X, because it complicates America's racial conversation, and because it sounds futuristic and sounds kind of cool. What we say is, if you are a campaign and you're talking to voters, you should talk to voters in the terms that they use. And so when we poll, it is true, most places, people like to be called Hispanic. So if you're a campaign and you're doing a mail piece and you're going to use a term, you should probably use Hispanic. However, language is constantly changing, and Latinx is an advocacy term that is trying to be more inclusive. Oftentimes in advocacy, you try out a lot of terms before something sticks. And so Latinx is a trial term. It does not come from the US. It actually comes in part from Latin American movement, where you actually see the X used a lot. You now see Latine also being used. So for us, we use all the terms interchangeably because it seems a little bit like a sideshow, in that people should go by what they think they prefer to be called. And you're going to use different terms in different contexts. Again, if you're a campaign, you probably should be saying Hispanic or Latino, but there are other contexts where people are trying to push, and that's a good thing.
Never fails, right? Every time I start speaking on mute. This question is from a student of mine, Samuel, and he wants to go a little bit deeper on the Trump Texas voter. And in particular, did you see a rural-urban divide? So for instance, did the Trump new voters tend to lean rural? Were they outside of the Dallases and the Austins?
Yeah, great question. So, the shift the shift you see in the metro areas of Texas is on the lower end of the spectrum. It is not a huge shift. I think it's more equivalent to what you might see in like a Maricopa in Arizona, where you did have like this Trump surge, but you had a Democratic surge to kind of rise up and meet it. So you didn't see, it was closer to kind of the baseline shift we see in most places. It is the RGV and some other parts of the border where you see like the real action, which I want to be very clear in the context of Texas, that's not the difference maker. Joe Biden could have blown out RGV as Democrats normally would, and he still would have lost Texas pretty handily. RGV ends up being between 10 to 15% of the Hispanic electorate. So it's not like the difference. But it's really important to study, one, because of its impact on congressional districts. Republicans will redistrict to get more districts down there to take advantage of these shifts. And two, because of what it might portend about shifts somewhere else. So the urban versus rural question, it's really interesting. It's not exclusively rural. For those of you who've been though in RGV, McAllen, Brownsville, like these are cities. I think we'd still call them urban, but they have a lot of rural attributes. So the division line doesn't work in quite the same way. I'd say the rural parts of Texas are more conservative, will always be more conservative. However, if you are Hispanic in a rural area, you are still more Democratic than if you are not Hispanic. So Hispanic still ends up being a difference with their white peers and neighbors. So rural is a fascinating dynamic, but I wouldn't say it was the full story of the Trump shifts. If you look elsewhere, some of his biggest shifts were in very urban places, like Miami is
Mhm.
as urban as you get. New York, Bronx, as urban as you get.
And this is something that David Martin highlights in the chat. He's like, look, in Texas, we have 3 million Latinx voters, but the percentage of those in the RGV are relatively small. But I mean, Carlos, you know this, the media attention, everything was zoomed in on this narrow strip. I'm trying to combine some questions here. I think I'm going to go to Carolina's question, which is, let me read it out here and then we'll get to it. Do you think that the several different topics that were important to Latinos who voted Democrat, demonstrating that their interests are spread or diffuse, is an illustration of this idea that Democrats have been taking Latinos for granted? And I think here I would insert that the focus is purely on immigration. And correspondingly, what would you say to that? Comparatively, Republicans took Latinos more seriously in the last election. Let me end there because I think this is that question, immigration.
Oh, yeah. And immigration, we could just do 2 hours on immigration because I think the ways in which it is used and misused is really important. Because yes, there are conservative Latinos who have more conservative views on immigration. Immigration as a set of policies is also not the same thing as immigration as an identity and as a sense of who is with you and who is not with you. And so like people will often say, myself included, immigration is not the only issue. You should not just talk to Latino voters about immigration. But it does end up being this really important threshold question, which helps you, in the absence of other cues, very quickly sort who's with me and who's not with me. Even if I might have some more conservative views on immigration. We see it all the time in focus groups. And I think that's really important from the Democratic side, because it means when there is not meaningful differentiation on immigration, Democrats are going to do worse among Latinos. So shying away from the issue is not the answer here. It is quite the opposite. I'm going to tie this in. There were a lot of questions about RGV. So I want to say it's about RGV. People ask, what shifted Latinos toward Trump in 2020? The right question is, what held them back in 2016? And it's different because there's something that was holding people back from Donald Trump in 2016 and from Mitt Romney in 2012. And what was that? And what you have, especially among a conservative Latino, is a sense that I don't know this guy. He is, quote, in a focus group, a clown. And he comes out the gate. From the moment he comes down the escalator, he is saying things that are perceived to be anti-Latino, anti-immigrant, if not anti-Latino, as opposed to Clinton, who is a known quantity. So you have this big difference. And so a lot of people just say, I'm sitting this one out. I can't vote for Donald Trump, or I can vote for Hillary Clinton, who is a historic candidate in some other ways, and someone I know, and I support the kind of prosperity my family knew in the Clinton years. And so you have this difference where people are holding back. There, as we said in time, there's a force field. There's a dam between some conservatives and voting for Donald Trump or any Republican. And a big part of that dam is immigration. Again, not just as a set of policies, but as like, who's with me and who's against me on this. And what happens in 2020, among many other things, is the water, it gets muddied on immigration. There are, especially online, a lot of attacks on Democrats, on Biden as having been part of the Obama deportation machine. You now hear it in focus groups. People say, well, Democrats didn't exactly deliver on immigration either. And while they disagreed with Trump's immigration policies, by the end of 2020, as we got deep into the election season, he was not talking about immigration in the same way. And especially among Latinos, he was de-emphasizing it heavily. And as we get there into late 2020, what we're talking about is COVID. What we're talking about is the economy. And if you want to oversimplify this, if the election is a referendum on the economy, Trump was going to do better. If it had been a referendum on immigration, he was going to do worse. That is like the basic, simplest way to think of 2020. Along the border, it's a little bit different in a way that we could talk about, but like the border became so much more salient. Trump was going down there all the time. Other Trump officials were going down there. Republican officials were going down there. And the idea of the border being insecure, of asylum seekers being those who are now homeless in squares in Brownsville, became a much more compelling narrative, even among those who today tell us we should legalize all undocumented immigrants. The way Trump put people in detention camps is unfair. Dreamers have gotten a raw deal. They will say that and also say, yeah, but we should do something about the border. And something was what Trump was doing. And so that's where, sorry, it's a long way to say, that's where Democratic action becomes really, really important. and where Democrats are showing up and actually delivering on something like immigration helps to create a differentiation that maintains higher margins. And when that goes away, there's an opening for Republicans that they're able to exploit.
I am so glad, Carlos, that you took us back to 2016, because I think a critical piece of understanding 2020, and more particularly understanding the Trump Latino dynamic in 2020, is 2016. Because 2016 was what you said, it was more of a question that they held back because of the rhetoric of Trump, where Trump, you could argue, was actively antagonistic toward Latinos. It was during the beginning part of his administration, but given everything that was happening with COVID, we didn't see that offense. And then on top of that, as you pointed out earlier, Trump did a 180 and started actively courting Latinos, because for those of you who remember 2016, not only was Trump not going after Latinos, we had the attacking of the Latino community. That changes completely in 2020. So you have these two factors that provide that boost for that potential linkage. Okay, a lot of questions here. This is good. An anonymous attendee asks, very timely question, right? Regarding voting accessibility. If any of the polling y'all do or data that you've seen, Carlos, taps into concerns of the Latino electorate about their ability to access the polls. What is your sense about the suppressive effect on Latino turnout, given the new Texas laws and laws also that are being passed across the state? I'm sorry, across the nation.
Yeah, great question. What I'd say is it's a hard one. The process of voting is something that with the kind of voters who we're trying to engage, is hard to kind of drive home the resonance of. We could talk about why. It's interesting. So what I'd say, 2020 was an interesting case study because in states like Nevada, all of a sudden, everybody was getting a ballot at home, and it was a different ballgame. And so some of the accessibility issues kind of go away, and you can kind of compare. Mm-hmm. And what I'd say, like now in this new moment of voting rights, where we are doing some research in terms of how you message this, I think a challenge you have is that it gets caught up in the partisan conversation. It's like, well, yeah, of course, each side wants to change the rules to benefit them. We haven't gotten quite to the point where it's an outrage against these changes that might make it harder for somebody to vote or infringe on their freedom to vote. That's the short answer. I think there's good research from people like Bernard Fraga on the turnout gap that shows that the difference in Latino voting and the lower Latino voting rates, you can't just blame on accessibility, even though if we were to fix some of these issues, obviously making it easier is better for everyone. And certainly some of the changes that we've seen in the last few months in Texas or in Arizona or in Georgia or coming up into Florida are moving things in the wrong direction when the goal is for everyone to vote. And I'll say that as someone who often sides on the Democratic side, and yet the polling shows just because everyone votes doesn't mean it's going to be better for Democrats. It's better for democracy.
So this question from Daisy is about, what is there that keeps Latinos, Hispanics, Latinx folks together? So kind of comparing the relationship that the Democratic Party has with African Americans, being more loyal to the Democratic Party. What do you think are the most important factors for kind of a larger Latino unity, staying with the Democratic Party nationally, but also in Texas?
Yes, and I was answering Norma's question on sample sizes, which I always appreciate sample size questions. Well, yeah, and I would say that I want to actually step back a second because I feel like you can't totally answer any questions about Latino voting without kind of getting at a root thing, which is you could pull aside all these questions of socioeconomics, how long Latinos have been in this country, whether they've been fully socialized. And there's this problem we have, which is that many Latinos feel othered in the country. They feel like they're made to feel like guests in this country. Mm-hmm. And as someone put it in a focus group, it's like being a guest in someone's home. And when you're a guest in someone's home, you don't sit down without permission, much less start to move around the furniture. And so to get to a point where Latinos are voting at their full potential, and on top of that, fighting to defend their freedom to vote, requires kind of addressing that gap, that belonging gap, and inclusion gap. And part of the Democrats taking Latinos for granted is elites mobilizing Latinos, hearing that Latinos are important, hearing that I want your vote, I want you as part of my coalition from both sides, is part of what starts helping to close that gap.
That otherization piece, Carlos, is so key and so critical, and something we see with other immigrant communities as well, and with the Asian American community as well. And how do you close that gap? We have a couple of minutes left before we close out, and I love to crystal ball, so I'm going to ask you to crystal ball with me. Looking to 2022, we know that traditionally the president's party in office usually doesn't do as great. In some instances, has taken a shellacking. Give us your sense of what the midterm election is going to bring, what Latinos are likely to be doing in the midterms, and if you want, maybe take a gander at 2024.
Great question. I've tried to stay out of the prediction game because I think it generally ends badly. And I feel like, the feature of, the last 10 years has been just pure unpredictability. But I will say,
how about things to watch out for, things to keep
our
eye on?
I'll say things to watch out for. I think that's the right framework. Well, first of all, redistricting conversation, which you kind of alluded to, is a big one here. I think we have to see how these districts end up getting drawn. I think, and what assumptions get drawn into those, right? Because you had a narrow margin in 2020. Does that mean Republicans gamble a little bit more in drawing Hispanics into districts, or they do that they usually do, which is try to just pack Hispanics into as few districts as possible, and to minimize overall influence and impact, and draw more Republican lines. So I think that's a big question, just redistricting and where Latinos end up in that process. I'd say what I'm tracking overall are the motivation levels, and whether we're looking both at those swing voters who showed up for the first time in 2020, and we are trying to pay some attention to those who didn't vote, show up in 2020. We're the 50% of Latinos who sat on the sidelines. So we are. So I think motivation levels overall, enthusiasm for voting. I know we generally do that, but I think going down to a subgroup level and seeking out polling that is getting bigger samples, that is going deeper on these electorates and aren't just a simple crosstab with 100 Latinos in a huge state like Texas. So I think state level polling in particular is going to be interesting going into 2022. We're paying a lot of attention to Senate races. So I'd say Arizona is just going to be another battle royale, more so than it has been in the past. And I think it'll be a real test of whether what we've seen in Arizona is a linear trend or whether it's something that's going to swing back and forth. Kristen Sinema did very well with Latinos in 2018. Clearly, she has a calculus that is not as important. And I think it's a really interesting case study to see Sinema and Mark Kelly take very different approaches in Arizona and see how Latinos respond to those approaches. Nevada is going to be, as always, incredibly fascinating. People have chalked it up as a safe Democratic seat, but it continues to have very narrow margins. And it is Latinos and what Latinos decide to do who could end up moving in one form or the other. And then I'd be remiss not to mention my home state of Florida. Florida has both a Senate and a governor's race, and we'll have probably some critical U.S. House races. And nobody knows ever what's going to happen in Florida. For every demographic trend in Florida, you have an equal and countervailing trend. Obviously what we saw in 2020 was disturbing in South Florida as far as the magnitude of the swing. The question is, can Democrats make up the difference somewhere else? Because I don't think that was unfortunately, I don't think that was a one-time thing. But the big wild card is, what else is Biden able to accomplish? Are Democrats able to get immigration done? This is the year to get immigration done. Don't push it out into next year. And does that start to change some of the calculus, in addition to everything they've already been doing, and some of these other pieces of the infrastructure package that are very popular among all voters, but especially among Latinos?
Okay, Carlos, you gave us more than enough for us to make our own predictions based on that. If you haven't checked out EquisLabs work, I encourage you to do so. Such great work, Carlos. Thank you to you and the EquisLab team. Check out Carlos on Twitter, EquisLabs work, and gracias for joining us today, Carlos.
Thank you for having me.
Take care, y'all.